Good day. My name is Jan Yves Remy. I am a director at the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies. I wanted to thank Marie Claire and the team for the invitation to address you, even if unfortunately I couldn't be there in Baku. I hope you're enjoying the opportunity to meet and exchange wonderful ideas about how we can work together to solve the climate crisis. So the perspective from which I usually speak is the one of trade. And in this whole discussion about climate change, we're moving finally to a point in the evolution of the debate where I think people are beginning to see trade as not an adversary to climate change efforts and mitigation adaptation, but actually as a companion. And I'm very proud of the work that I'm doing together with two professors from Yale and Tufts University as part of the Remaking Trade for a Sustainable Future project, which aims to make the trade system more fit for purpose when it comes to climate and other sustainable development goal imperatives. So I've been asked to speak about something that is often difficult for persons to get their heads around. And I must admit, we struggled to figure out exactly what the intersection between trade and climate was, even if at the very beginning we know that finance was very much closely aligned with trade because the Bretton Woods institutions were created as a tripartite set of institutions, with trade being one of the cornerstones of the renewed, reinvigorated post-World War II international economic system. I think somewhere along the way, the interconnectedness of these three bodies, especially as it relates to trade and finance, has been lost. So one of the ways that we are thinking of revitalizing the debate is by thinking of how trade policy and trade laws can actually improve, especially for developing countries, access to finance, and vice versa. How can finance actually improve trade opportunities for developing countries? And I wanted to share with you 3 or 4 tangible areas that we have been looking at in our Remaking Trade project. The first one is to understand that in achieving climate objectives, and in particular meeting the financial aspects of these objectives, the trade liberalization through exchange of tariffs and lowering ultimately of tariff concessions can actually provide greater access to the environmental goods and services that will allow for lowering of the costs by developing countries for climate solutions, such as solar panels, wind turbines, and even other energy efficient appliances. Now, we don't want to only think in terms of the areas where developed countries have a comparative advantage or larger developing countries have a comparative advantage. We can think also of climate neutral or even climate enhancing services. So for instance, environmental services that can be offered by developing countries. This is an opportunity for greater access to these types of services at lower prices through liberalized trade. And often we also think about alternative to the types of goods that increase the GHG emissions to the atmosphere. And if we think of developing countries increasingly providing more climate-friendly products, that's another way of making these products cheaper and therefore unleashing more finance in countries to actually tackle climate problems. The second, I think, more proactive way that we could think about finance being unlocked to deal with climate problems as through the trade system is through carbon markets. Now, I understand that in Baku, there's been some progress in coming up with solutions to developing countries requesting that the infrastructure for creating greater carbon markets be actually developed. And for many developing countries that are actually carbon sinks, or either through their oceans or through their forests, this is also an opportunity for them to actually do two things. One, contribute to other countries' greenhouse gas emission problems or reduction commitments, as well as gain actual credits and actually be able to use these credits in order for them to be able to meet their climate needs and get out of this unsustainable debt through the usage of the natural resources around them. So that's another way that we think trade, climate, and finance can be aligned in the same direction. The other thing that I would want to think about would be green investment and supply chains. So global supply chains can promote climate finance by adopting sustainable standards, incentivizing green investments in production and transportation. And private sector trade actors can fund climate projects, often linked to compliance with environmental, social, and governance criteria. So we at the Remaking Trade Project, one of our major core areas where we actually think that the trade system can move the needle on climate and therefore climate finance is by standardizing processes, technical regulations that all countries have to abide by in order for them to produce in an environmentally friendly way. So this is another role that trade can actually play in bringing about climate enhancing or climate reduction enhancing standards, and thereby increasing again trade opportunities, especially for developing countries that have to comply with these standards, and thereby through these standards allowing greater investment into their countries by investors that ultimately have to comply in their home countries with these ESG and other criteria. The two last things I wanted to say also were we could think of a broader agenda. I started off talking about the Bretton Woods institutions. The broader agenda that we actually have in mind is to actually reform the finance system by making countries, giving them, especially developing countries, greater access to international development capital so that their needs and their debt can be alleviated. And that is being done through things like the Bridgetown Agenda, now in its third iteration. As countries get more access to concessionary loans, as well as grants and debt forgiveness, they can then begin prioritizing in areas where they actually have a comparative advantage in trade. So they can invest in the infrastructure, in the goods and services that are climate friendly and will allow them to actually compete. So reform of the finance architecture will lead countries to get greater amounts of credit out of debt, out of unsustainable debt, and therefore can participate in international trade and global commerce. And the WTO, lastly, should serve as a forum for these types of discussions. So not only in changing and accommodating in the substantive rules, but equally thinking about the WTO just as a forum where the DG, as well as the heads of the IMF, World Bank, and other companion institutions that have a role to play will continue talking, continue meeting of the minds, continue adopting a whole of international trade policy, international economic policy approach, and understanding the interlinkages that exist through these different organizations. I talked much more than I was expected to, but I hope that this has been useful, and I wish you continued success in your discussions and the best of the times in Baku. Thank you so much.